to the Vocal Fries Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Megan Figueroa.
And I'm Carrie Gillen.
And congratulations to us.
Congratulations to us. Yeah.
Yes. We might be talking right now to people that had never heard of our podcast until like a week ago.
That's true. Yeah. So, yeah, welcome to any new listeners who came to us via the New York Times, and thank you to
the New York Times
for mentioning our podcast.
Yes.
I was very shocked. I was like, oh, wow, my name is in the New York Times.
It is, a couple times. And we were in there. It was an article, 5 podcasts for word nerds, which is always fun to be included with the other people that were on there. But yeah, it was quite the shock. And actually, the person that pointed us to that was our guest today, which is fun.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, he emailed us and told us, and he's like, oh, I'm sorry if you've gotten a million emails about this. I was like, what? No.
Yeah,
zero.
No,
This is the
zero.
first one.
Yeah. Yeah. So
that's amazing.
Yeah.
And we should probably also shout out all the other ones, just because it's, there are companions on this journey.
Yes.
The Illusionist. And I've been to one of their live shows, and it was a lot of fun.
Oh, you have? In Vancouver?
No, in Boston. Remember when I went to that podcast
yeah, okay.
conference?
Yeah.
Definitely would recommend. Words Unraveled.
Nice.
And Away with Words.
They're great. They're on an NPR, right?
Yes.
Like every weekend.
We've been on panels with them, right?
Yes, yeah.
I'm not forgetting that. And then Lingthusiasm, who are also they've been around 6 months longer than us. So
yeah,
they helped us at the very beginning with some advice, so that was very helpful.
Yeah.
So we're in good company. That's what I'm
definitely in good company. Yes.
And speaking of media coverage, we were both asked to talk about Trump's odd tweeting style and also speech style, and you said no.
I said I didn't want to sound like just a mad woman that's mad at him, and I just didn't trust myself.
Okay, fair enough.
But you did. You trusted yourself.
I responded, yeah. And then I was, wow. I got a lot of coverage in that. I was shocked.
Yes, but you sounded good. You sounded good. You sounded like you knew what you were talking about. You didn't sound like a mad woman.
No, I didn't. I did not. And I did say this is actually not my area of expertise, but here are my thoughts.
But one of the big points that you pointed out was his all caps.
Well, she asked about the all caps, and so I responded to the all caps. So yeah, we're going to talk about 2 different posts, so one on Truth Social and one on Twitter/X, and just notice if you can tell which one is written by him and which one is not.
Yes, exactly. You don't even have to be a linguist or someone who has been studying the way he speaks at all to tell the difference.
No, this is the kind of thing where, authorial style is just so obvious.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here's the Truth Social post. I don't know what they're called. Are they called truths? I don't know.
It kind of would make sense if they were. It'd kind of be
true.
A mistake if they weren't.
I've never been on. I've only seen people's screenshots.
Yeah.
So this is at Real Donald Trump. I won the last 2 debates. One with Crooked Joe. The other with Lion Kamala. I accepted the Fox News invitation to debate Kamala on September 4th, but she turned it down. J.D. Vance easily won his debate with Tampon Tim Walz, who called himself a knucklehead. I am also leading in the polls, with the lead getting bigger by the day, and leading in all swing states. The first thing a prize fighter does when he loses a match is say that he, quote, demands a rematch. It is very late in the process. Voting has already begun. There will be no rematch. Besides, Kamala stated clearly yesterday that she would not do anything different than Joe Biden, so there's nothing to debate. Thank you for your attention to this matter, Donald J. Trump.
He signed it? He signed it at the end?
He tried to sign his Trump post. So that was all caps, every single thing. All
I was
caps.
going to say, good job in conveying that it was in all caps.
And it's so ridiculous, still trying to call. So this was October 9th, so this is relatively recent.
Yeah.
He's still trying to call Tim Walz tampon Tim
It's
Walz.
not going to
It's
stick.
it's just like, no one cares, dude. And
No
the people
one.
who do care are creeps. And I
Yeah.
know that is your target audience, but also it's still like not everybody. Like
Right.
there's probably plenty of people who are like willing to vote for you who don't care about this. It's just weird
Yeah, it's really weird.
and sounds so babyish. Like
I mean, everything he says sounds whiny. That's
true. He is such a whiny baby.
He
It's
is a whiny
amazing.
baby. Yep.
It's amazing. Anyway, so you're gonna tell us about a tweet.
A tweet from @RealDonaldTrump. So here we go. It's a little bit longer. So we are now known all throughout the world as Occupied America. But to everyone here in Colorado and all across our nation, I make you this vow. November 5th, 2024 will be Liberation Day in America. I will rescue Aurora and every town that has been invaded and conquered. And we will put these vicious and bloodthirsty criminals in jail or kick them the hell out of our country. In honor of Jocelyn Nungary, Laken Riley, and Rachel Morin, and all of the others that are dead and mortally wounded at the hands of migrants who should never have been allowed into our country, I am announcing today that upon taking office, we will have an Operation Aurora at the federal level. To expedite removals of this savage gang, I will invoke the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to target and dismantle every migrant criminal network operating on American soil. No person has inflicted the violence and terror that Kamala Harris has inflicted on this community can ever be allowed to become president of the United States. And that was from October 11th.
Yeah.
It's,
so.
I mean, it's completely different from what you... It's
Yeah.
horrifying. Both are horrifying to me in different ways. This one's scary policy stuff that's, going to happen if he's elected.
In fact, it's scarier, right? Like, because it actually has policy, terrifying anti-immigrant policy.
Terrifying.
Like fascistic policy.
Well, yeah.
Versus him calling someone tampon Tim and just railing against the Kamala. Like, it's very different levels of fear for me.
It is. Yeah, definitely. And yeah, no, I believe him when he says this. Like, I know it was probably written by someone else.
Yes. And as you said,
Stephen Miller
probably. If not him, someone like him.
Yeah.
Because he's not the only one.
Nope. I think it was this week too when Donald Trump said that migrants were born with bad genes. So he's using eugenics language too, which is not surprising for a fascist.
No, they love to talk about genes, even though they have a zero understanding of genetics. Don't know any genes at all. Don't understand how they work.
Right.
It's just a way of saying you.
You, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, two very different ways that Donald Trump comes across, but both terrifying.
Both terrifying, yeah. I've seen people call the latter one like akin to Radio Rwanda. And that is what it feels like. It really does feel like he's this close to calling them cockroaches.
Yeah. I'm surprised he hasn't.
He probably does behind closed doors.
Yeah, that's true. It's
really scary.
Awful. That's why I guess we won't talk to you until after the election. So hopefully it's good news. Hopefully you go out there and vote.
Oh, yes. Speaking of voting, I just voted.
Nice.
In our provincial election. So here's hoping that the very, very weird, very right-wing Conservative Party does not win.
Is there a chance?
Yes.
Oh, no. So yeah, get out there and vote.
Please vote.
And hopefully next time you hear us, we aren't depressed. But we have a really great episode for you today. Very, very interesting.
Yes, I'm very excited for y'all to listen. And,
enjoy.
Okay, so today we're very excited to have Elia Powers, who is an associate professor of journalism in the Department of Mass Communication at Towson University, a sports features and podcast editor at the Baltimore Watchdog, and an independent podcaster, reporter, producer, and host. And he's here today to talk about his book, Performing the News, Identity, Authority, and the Myth of Neutrality. So welcome.
Thank you both. I appreciate being here.
How could we not when we're both in here?
That is
we
true.
are.
Full
We
disclosure.
are quoted. But this is an interesting topic anyway. It would have been a perfect topic, even if we weren't in your book.
No, this is 100% in our wheelhouse. Very, very interesting.
It's very interesting.
And in fact, there's also like the very first person other than yourself that you talk about is a former guest of our show too.
Indeed, I heard the episode.
Yeah.
Yes. Also cited in the book. So
Yes.
yeah, Dion Braxton. So thank you so much. Our first question is always the same one. Why did you want to write this book and why now?
So a couple of reasons. One, I'll just start with the personal. I think all book authors probably have some personal reason to take on a years-long project. When I was younger, I had a pretty severe stutter, and I was also talk fast. I continue to kind of talk fast. That hasn't really changed over the years. But I was really interested in getting into broadcast journalism, radio or television. And no one ever told me in so many words, you know, you shouldn't do that because you don't have a voice for radio, as they say. But I kind of picked up on that through just who I heard on television and radio. And I just kind of had a sense that I didn't necessarily fit into what a typical broadcast journalist sounds like. So, you know, years pass, I end up going from print journalism into my current career as a professor, teaching journalism and podcasting. And I started to see a lot of journalists sort of coming forward with stories about feeling like for whatever reason, they didn't fit into radio or TV because they didn't have the traditional news anchor voice or the public radio voice. And so I started to do some research just about sort of speech disabilities and journalists and their feeling of whether they felt accepted or not. And I just felt like there hadn't really been a full sort of narrative told around journalists' experiences and how they kind of get a sense of how to sound professional. And then finally, like I said, I teach a podcasting class now, and I've had no voice training other than like a week at a podcasting workshop. And I want to be supportive of students, but I also didn't really know exactly what the norms were in the news industry. So I wanted to just frankly be able to be more informed and tell them, here are some of the things you have to think about when you're doing on-air narration, and also here's the way that the industry is changing. So those are the three main reasons why I embarked on this years-long project.
So you talk about what you don't know, like what the norms are or anything, but it turns out, sure, there are norms, but as you mentioned in your book, there's no like actual like institutional, you must do these things in order to be a journalist, right? Like to be a lawyer or whatever, you have all these hoops you have to jump through. So I found that really interesting. I hadn't really thought about it, but you're right. There isn't almost no bar to entry in some ways, but then there's a bunch of bars that you talk about in this book.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like journalism differs from like, you know, law and medicine and other professions where, you know, it's like a lot of codes of conduct and kind of barriers of entry. Everything is very formalized. And right, as you're saying, in journalism, people pick it up through osmosis. It's mostly, oh, you know, you hear through back channels or you kind of get a sense of this is how you're supposed to sound, or people tell you in conferences or whatnot. So yeah, but it's very much, it's never written down, you know, anywhere really in like, you know, handbooks. It's all very much word of mouth.
Yeah, I used to work at Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at ASU as a student worker. And I remembered the students that took the broadcast journalism classes, how they would change. Like all of a sudden I would see that they had a different hair color. Then I would say like, see that they started talking a little bit different, like as the semester went on. And so it's in these institutions, there may not be like a playbook, but there is kind of like a playbook in a way, right?
Yeah, and like every person who's taught a broadcasting or podcasting course, they all have a couple students who they can remember who like they talk just normal in conversation like they're 20, and then all of a sudden you say, oh, go record yourself, and all of a sudden they're like trying to do their best like Walter Cronkite or you know, or Diana Sawyer impression, and it's like oftentimes they're very over the top. You know, it's like almost like they watched Anchorman or they watched you know, some maybe more modern show with a journalist, and they're like, oh, okay, this is what I'm supposed to be doing because this is what's normalized.
Yeah, when I read that part of the book, the thing that came to my mind actually, which is so horrifying, but I thought about Alex Jones. So I listened to a podcast about him. I do not listen to him directly. But when he's trying to sound like, oh, this is a really important thing, he puts on this really over the top anchor voice, and it makes me laugh every single time because it's so pompous. And it's also like, dude, this is not your lane. Like, you're a conspiracy theorist. Just stick with that.
I've never listened to him, but I can imagine what you're talking about.
It's worse than you even think, I think.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you mean by performing the news?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, because some people have like looked at the title and been like, performing. I don't perform. I'm a journalist. I, just present the news. So the performance, I mean, not to get too deep into the academic literature and communication, but Erving Goffman, who's actually a sociologist, talks about sort of this front stage, backstage self-presentation. We're sort of always performing depending on what audience we're speaking to. And in journalism, that's very true, because not only are you performing a version of yourself when you're at the office, when you're in meetings and just kind of behind the scenes, but if you're on air, you're also performing for sort of this imagined audience out there who's listening to you. So a lot of journalists I spoke to, I mean, sometimes you hear people say, well, so-and-so anchor sounds exactly the same on air that they sound, in person. Like you kind of be shocked. Oh, okay, that's what you actually sound like. But more often than not, my experience has been there's a performative nature to actually speaking on air. Like a great example of this, I mentioned in one of the chapters, there's this hashtag customer service voice on TikTok, where this isn't just journalists. I mean, this is people in customer service and other kind of front-facing professions will literally show themselves talking normally, and then they will sort of snap the fingers, put on their performative voice. And, it's just, you can see so starkly the difference between the two. And a lot of news anchors have gone viral on TikTok, just sharing what they do to go from their very kind of like accented regional voice to their sort of everywhere but nowhere, geographically unidentifiable newscaster voice. So what I mean by performing is just basically the version of yourself, both in voice and also just in appearance, that journalists sort of put on when they are in front of the public. And the norms differ, again, very much depending on whether you're in public radio or local TV, or in podcasting is obviously kind of a whole different ballgame, which we could talk about later if you want. But that's what I mean by performing.
I'm just thinking that I totally do this when I call anywhere to like ask for a service rendered, like calling to the vet to ask about something or whatever. I have this voice that I change into. I don't really know if I do it for podcasting. Carrie, do you think I do?
You change a little because everybody does.
Yeah.
We sound different when we're talking to the audience versus when it's just the two of us going, oh, wait, maybe we should cut that out.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, exactly.
I wouldn't say like it's a huge change, but it is a change.
There's a change. Yeah. That's so interesting. And so what is it that you mean by performance neutrality?
Right. And so when we talk in journalism about neutrality, usually the default is, we're talking about reporting, right? Don't involve yourself in the story, try to be down the middle, don't anger both sides or please no one. But I'm not talking about that type of neutrality. What I'm talking about, what I kept hearing from journalists is things like, I was told by a producer I needed to tone down the way I spoke, meaning maybe I sounded too young, or there are a lot of code words that are used, too urban, too excitable. I mean, there's a lot of examples of that. But so this idea of kind of like flattening your voice, sort of almost trying to kind of hide a little bit about not just your personality, but also your background and your identity. So that's sort of the flattening. There's also this, like, in the sense of trying to sound placeless, right? This idea of trying to be, I think one former NPR programming director, so once said that the sort of ideal is to be ambiguously genuine, meaning to be kind of like, they sound like a real person, but they don't sound like they're a specific age or that they're from a specific place. And so, again, the idea of neutrality, I was sort of trying to figure out, like, what's a term that I could sort of come up with that would encapsulate this idea that you're sort of trying when you're on air in some cases to, again, sound generic, sound widely acceptable. And in doing so, especially journalists from historically marginalized backgrounds, is who I mostly talk to in this book, they feel like to do that often means to hide where they're from, how they're used to talking, and to do that in order to be, sort of viewed as professional. And you mentioned, Deion Broxton, your former guest, and that was one of the first, he was one of the first people I spoke to for the story. He went to my university. I never taught him, but, we kind of crossed paths. But he was basically saying, I was told in no uncertain terms that I just, the way that I sounded wasn't acceptable, and then I needed to be more broadly acceptable to people all across the U.S. And so when I talk about neutrality, right, I'm sort of just talking about this idea of trying to be unidentifiable almost, sort of geographically and broadly acceptable. That's sort of the idea here.
And unfortunately, that for historically marginalized groups, that is ultimately, it could be racist, because I'm thinking about like radio, where you can do linguistic profiling and you can like suddenly meet someone and be like, oh, I didn't know you were Black. You sound white.
Yeah, I mean, I heard there was a horrifying story where, again, both ways. So some journalists were told basically they sounded too black. I mean, not in those exact words, but that was sort of the clear implication. Other times, people on radio would say, "Well, we want a diverse sounding host. This host doesn't sound diverse," which meant that they didn't sound black enough. It was sort of like there was all these stereotypes around how somebody in a certain race or ethnicity should sound. But, as I mentioned in the book, and a lot of other people I talked to said, I mean, right, there's not obviously one way that someone who comes from a different culture or background should or needs to sound, right? That's a very narrow way of thinking about things.
Yes, very narrow. So do the institutional norms of broadcast journalism promote linguistic bias?
Yeah, I certainly think they do to an extent. One of the interesting things that I found, right, in looking at it, I was sort of always wondering, like, where did these standards come from and these norms come from? I mean, like, as long as I've been following broadcast journalism, there's just sort of been this, again, kind of general American, Midwestern way of speaking. And I found it really interesting that not only in the US and TV news, but also with like the BBC and in a lot of other countries, there was a very distinct effort to sort of standardize the way that broadcasters sounded. And those decisions, right? Oftentimes they turn to linguists, they turn to people who studied all this and were from, in the US, obviously they were often from the Midwest. So I found it really interesting that people that were actually making the decisions about what's considered to be sort of a professional way of thinking were generally white men from Ohio or the Midwest. So in some ways, it's sort of no surprise that ended up being seen as the standard, right? People making the decisions obviously affect what's considered to be normal or neutral. So I do think in that way, it definitely promoted discrimination as far as everyone else was sort of seen as otherized, right? Southern accents, very thick Northeastern accents, regional dialects, those types of things from the start, I think were viewed as sort of unprofessional.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about like how newscasts in the South often don't have people that sound like they're from the South, even though that's their region that they're reporting in. And so did you talk to anyone who changed their Southern accent for their job?
Several people, including a couple of voice coaches who talked to me. They basically were like, I realized early on when I was in broadcasting, I couldn't speak like I was from the South. It just wasn't seen as well educated. You still hear I can't say I've listened to every local news station and sampled, but my sense is you still hear very few heavy sort of regional accents, even in those regions. The one area which is interesting that I didn't go into in too much detail, but I think I know about just because I'm a sports fan, is like if you hear like NASCAR announcers and broadcasters, college football announcers and broadcasters, it's actually an asset in a lot of ways to sound like you're from that community. It does seem like more of those people tend to be white. And that's sort of a very specific Southern accent. But I think it is advantageous in certain parts of media, but in sort of the mainstream, less so. Although, again, I will say things are changing. I mean, I've noticed in public radio, Aisha Raska was one person that came up in numerous conversations. I didn't actually speak to her, but was mentioned a lot about somebody who sounds from North Carolina, very much sounds like she's from North Carolina. And so I think on NPR, there is increasingly, I think you hear more accent diversity. I think it's gotten better, but still not necessarily, representative of the U.S. as a whole.
Yeah, I've noticed it here in Canada too. So I was away for over a decade. And when I came back, I noticed a lot more different accents, like clearly South Asian accents on the radio. And I'm just like, oh, this is exciting. And the other thing that I was thinking of while I was reading your book is Dion Story. I was like, I wonder if he had stayed in sports, like, because that's what his original idea, if he would have been able to keep at least more of his accent, because I feel like in the sports world, like you just said, there's some more varieties allowed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder too. I think there's a decent chance that would have been the case.
Yeah, and I think about sports broadcasting, and I'm thinking, okay, so it's football season. There are a lot of former football players that are now commentators. They get to be themselves, I've noticed.
But they're stars too.
Yeah, so is that why they get to be more authentic, I guess? Is because they are stars, or they have this credibility about them because they played?
I think that's actually a really good point. Yeah, and I hadn't really thought of it that way. But right, if you sort of built out credibility already, you already have that kind of built-in gravitas, right? You probably don't have to overcome those hurdles. They're authentic, whereas somebody who maybe is coming up through the business, doesn't get the right to sort of do the same thing, perform the same way.
Right. We all have to prove our credibility somehow.
Yeah, so that leads us into the next question really nicely, I think. Tell us about who we deem authoritative and trustworthy.
Yeah, I would jump to podcasting just for this answer here, because I do think that podcasting has very much changed radio. This is what I learned a lot in sort of reporting and talking to people who had moved from radio into podcasting, right? They were very used to performing a certain way. And when they got to podcasts, and sometimes for the same company, people who did public radio affiliated podcasts, who just the fact that they were now on a podcast and they sort of had a younger, more diverse audience meant that they could sort of let themselves loose a little bit and not feel constrained by the sort of old kind of norms of presentation. And so I think that's an example of how some of the norms were changing and how in podcasting, right? I mean, having younger sounding voices, having sort of non-traditional voices. As I mentioned in the book, I mean, there's not a lot, but more people who have speech disabilities, who stutter, who have other, voices that would not be considered typical broadcast voices. And I think that's shown to an extent that if you have something interesting to say, right, audiences will gravitate toward that. And I think this idea that audiences want a certain type of voice, I think has been sort of disproven in this medium. We can also, talk later if you want about vocal fry, which obviously is a topic near and dear to your heart, and upspeak. But I think a lot of that too, I've been heartened actually by some of the younger journalists that I've spoken to who have said that like voice coaches and mentors in the field are now telling them basically vocal fry is, do not worry about this. This is something that has just been brought up to make women feel less. So I do think, again, historically, I think what this has said was people who were considered authoritative or people who sort of, adhered to this very traditional way of speaking. I think, though, that what we're seeing is positive, that their audiences, once accents and different ways of speaking are normalized, right? People actually don't consider accents or different dialects distracting because they're just used to them, right? It's how they and their neighbors speak.
Exactly. I had a thought about the vocal fry. Damn it, it's gone.
I did too. I think it brings up a point that men and women are treated differently, since men also vocal fry, but women are the ones that are giving this.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know what you called it, unsolicited advice.
Yeah, that's it. So men with vocal fry are 100% seen as authoritative. And women, well, it depends on how old you are. So at this point, it's like if you're under 50, you're fine with it. It's just interesting.
Well, yeah. And actually that's, just to kind of piggyback off that, obviously I knew about audience complaints, right? I think people will complain forever and ever about something related to women's voices, whether it's upspeak or vocal fry or pitch or whatever. But the thing I found interesting in my reporting was talking to voice coaches about this, because a lot of them sort of pushed back on, really focused on what they perceived as sort of they said it's not about sexism. It's not about, we don't like vocal fry. Their argument had much more to do with, well, it's bad vocal technique, or it shows that you're not getting enough air through your lungs, or I'm not going to use exactly the terms that they use because I can't remember, but they were focused more on the technique. And I thought it was interesting just to hear different perspectives on it, and to hear, it was sort of a dance between trying to share what they thought about strong voices versus the built-in sexism. And that, I think it was interesting for them to try to navigate that, because I just thought it was interesting how they were trying to work within the system, right? I guess, so to speak.
Yeah. I do wonder, do they do that to men? Because lots of men use vocal fry. Like, it's really pervasive in men's voices. And I don't know. I think that they're fundamentally wrong. It doesn't harm your voice at all. It's the opposite direction. If you harm your vocal tract, sometimes you develop vocal fry. It's the only way you can talk.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
We've talked about it before.
Yeah, I also learned it was interesting how some female journalists were saying, they were trying to lower their voice earlier in their career, and that also was causing physical damage, because if you're speaking outside of your normal range. So anyway, I just thought, all of this was, I could have written the whole book on just women and voice, but I just thought it was interesting how the advice went in all directions, right?
Yes, it does go in all directions, yes.
Yeah, I've actually been told by two superiors to me that I need to get rid of my vocal fry if I'm going to be like a professor or a teacher or anything like that. One of them was from a linguist, so I was very offended by that, because a linguist should know better. The other one was from a speech pathologist who said that you will tend to get very hoarse if you're trying to project your voice. And I actually found that to be true.
That's interesting. So projecting your voice.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, all right. Fair enough then.
Yeah.
But then I'd still wonder about all those British male actors who are on the stage because they do everything.
They are projecting. They're on the stage, yeah.
Anyway.
Anyway, we can talk about how women are treated all day long. It's funny, though. We don't get any comments about our vocal fry, or specifically Megan's vocal fry, my vocal fry. I think because of the show name, I think we're like...
We've kind of immunized ourselves against that particular complaint.
Yeah.
We still get other sexist complaints, just not that one.
Yep, just not that one. Yep.
Okay, so what does it mean to sound like NPR, for example?
Okay. Sometimes I try my NPR voice out. It's sort of I think somebody described it as sort of a calm, soothing, like warm tea voice, right? It's sort of I'm not an actor, but it's interesting because when I mentioned this in the first chapter that I do think I unintentionally, when I have done voicing from my own, podcast projects, I don't think like, okay, perform like an NPR anchor, but I think I am in some ways shaped by that, again, just sort of naturally, because it's what I'm used to hearing. So it's definitely, that's at least, sort of historically, that's kind of been the kind of cliche, at least kind of very toned down. I mean, I referenced the old Saturday Night Live sketch, the Anna Gasteyer sketch for, she had on Alec Baldwin, and they talked about, I think it was called Delicious Dish.
Hello, I'm Margaret Jo McCullen.
And I'm Terry Rialto.
And you're listening to The Delicious Dish on National Public Radio.
That's like kind of like the norm for public radio. One author called it NPR-ness, right? So it's not necessarily like it's the same. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of vocal diversity. There has been forever, especially some of the early sort of, I guess they called themselves the founding mothers of NPR, right? Had very non-traditional Upper West Side New York sounding voices, and they leaned into that, right? It was not a traditional voice. It's just that over the years, the voices that tend to be copied tended to be white. And that was sort of just pretty obvious. But yeah, so, and again, this all gets to the audience, right? I mean, sort of what I heard from a lot of journalists, and this has been reported on in other studies and articles, is that the fear is always sort of not alienating the kind of target, the sort of older, white, well-educated coastal listener. And, you like what you're used to. And the NPR audience, they've tried to diversify and had sort of varying success. But I do think there has been I think that audience, and again, the fact that overwhelmingly people who run public radio stations and do the hiring are white, again, it just, you kind of are used to what you're used to hearing. And so that is the sort of traditional public radio voice. Again, even though I do think public radio does sound more diverse now, and again, largely because of some very prominent hosts of shows and also just podcasts that NPR has done that have been quite successful.
I always think of Dan Castellaneta, his character on Parks and Rec.
Oh my God.
Could one say that a book is nothing more than a painting of words, which are the notes on the tapestry of the greatest film ever sculpted?
One could say that. But should one?
It is so good. And he does do that like calming voice, kind of like, it sounds like it's like I take him more seriously once I hear that voice.
Really? Because I think you're not supposed to take him seriously.
No, I know. It makes me laugh. It makes me laugh. It's such a good character though. It's so good. I've been watching the morning show, so I've been like noticing. Have you seen it, Elliot?
You're talking about the streaming show?
Yeah, the streaming show.
Okay. I have not seen it. I've heard very mixed reviews. So I haven't. Everyone's recommended it. I haven't gotten around to it though.
Yeah, mixed reviews is accurate. Like
I would say
very, very good, and some of it is just complete trash.
Yeah, but I think that there's like Jennifer Aniston, for example, is a co-anchor, and I feel like she talks the same. It's just because she's acting, I think, and you don't really see this kind of, I don't know, linguistic bias so much in the show. So I don't think it'd be as interesting to you if you're going to look at it that angle kind of thing.
It's not really so much about that. And she also doesn't sound that different because it's a morning show, right? The morning show is a little bit more casual.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that came up a lot is just norms and like what, even within TV, right? I mean, there's like a national news sort of type of, performance, there's local news. Weather seems to have a much more loose, sports we talked about. But yeah, in morning, that's one of the reasons why one of the television journalists who did this TikTok kind of public or customer service voice, she was in morning news. And yeah, I think she just felt more like she could be loose than if she was like doing the evening news. You had to be more buttoned up. So it's just totally, I think that's a great point. Just about what the norms are and when you're on, what kind of news you're doing and what audience you're speaking to, right?
So is there a difference between TV and radio in terms of authentic self-presentation?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I focus mostly on public radio and local TV. And yeah, I mean, if you just had the audio and I played for you, 100 newscasters, you could tell me really quickly, is this a TV person or a radio person? Because, the TV voice is much, I mean, I guess, again, there's probably some overlap, but it's just, again, different norms, right? Radio has a certain, I mean, talk radio that's obviously a whole different story, which I didn't really get into in the book. That's just like how bombastic and loud can you be? But yeah, totally. I mean, TV has its own norms. And I mean, I would say there is really where the kind of Midwestern accentless voices really, there's been a lot less change there. I think the voices you hear in public radio sound different and are more diverse within public radio than you hear on local television. I think you could still, probably listen to or watch local TV in Phoenix and Seattle and Chicago and in Maine or whatever, and it would generally sound very similar. And again, it's interesting. I mean, I learned a little more about why that is. I mean, it's just sort of like a strategy. Like a lot of local TV journalists, they have to start off in a small market in Mississippi, then they have to go to a secondary market. And it's just like it's one of those things where just for career success, you have to kind of climb the ladder. And this idea, what you're told by agents and what you're told by coaches is, again, the more broadly palatable, the more kind of just generic you can sound, the farther along you'll go. So I do think the norms there are very different.
I'm just thinking about all of the news that I've consumed in my life, and it's mostly been from like Phoenix or Tucson. So I feel like we kind of have this accentless thing going on too. So I can't really tell if these people are from Arizona or not, but most of them, they could be or they couldn't be. I can't tell where they are. That's the whole point, right? Is like they're placeless. And so we can go back to podcasting now. Is this the same in podcasting? Do you think that people are allowed to have a more authentic self-representation?
Yeah, absolutely. In general, I mean, so one of the hard things about podcasting is I tell my podcast students, like, if you tell me you have a podcast, all I know is that you're talking to a microphone. Like, there's so much variety in podcasting. I mean, there are everything from very professionalized public radio podcasts and podcasts from, celebrities who are not even journalists, obviously, all the way down to like just sort of independent. So it's sort of hard to sort of generalize. But overall, I think, for certainly you see more vocal diversity. My chapter on podcasting, I call it vocally diverse and semi-performative. So there's still, podcasting sort of has this sort of, you kind of want the listener to feel like they're backstage with you, that you're kind of hearing authentic conversations. But as you two were just both saying, you still are maybe performing a little bit, right? You have maybe a slightly elevated version or something that you do a little differently. But yeah, I mean, everyone who I talk to in podcasting says just audiences have an expectation that you're going to be authentic. And one of the ways you do that is through presentation. The norms are different. Again, the audience tends to be younger. And also just practically, there's often just a less rank and file, just fewer people working at your organization. So you're not going to get sent to a voice coach necessarily as likely because you don't have the funding for that, or no one's there, or there's no interest there. So, without that sort of like built-in hierarchy, right, you're just likelier to try to be yourself. And this is very much still a DIY culture in podcasting, I think.
Yeah, and I really mostly prefer that. I do enjoy a lot of NPR, CBC, BBC's podcasts, but there are some podcasts that sound a little too polished for me, and I just am like, nah, I'd rather just listen to two people chat. But I know that these podcasts that I don't like, other people really love, so there's still a space for them.
Yeah, I like both ends. I mean, I love a good produced investigative series or a good produced, a serialized podcast. I mean, I listen to a lot of scripted podcasts that I just think are great. And those performances tend to be a little more buttoned up, a little more NPR sounding. But yeah, then Code Switch doesn't. Other podcasts, yeah, I mean, I just like hearing people who just sound like people I encounter in all aspects of my life. But I think the variety is so great. And that's one of the things that I love about podcasting is you could listen to 5 shows and feel like you're listening to 5 shows. Whereas again, in TV and some amount of radio, I think you don't necessarily feel like that as much.
That's so true.
That is definitely true. How does the myth of neutrality stifle diversity?
Right. Yeah. So, the idea that there are sort of neutral ways of performing, right? We sort of, as the audience, sort of take them for granted. Oh, yeah, there's a way that you're supposed to sound on radio or on TV. And it's almost taken for granted. We don't think critically about how that actually was constructed, right? A social construction that, again, decisions were made decades ago about what was considered to be authoritative. So yeah, then if you are a journalist, often from historically marginalized groups, women, journalists of color, to some extent journalists with disabilities. Yeah, you often, so the term that I use in the book, that's, another Irving Goffman term, covering, which is the idea that you're not hiding entirely, but you're kind of toning down or trying to kind of play down, again, your background, your heritage, where you're from, who you associate with. So you end up, again, that's where you end up having to change the way you talk, reduce your accent, even dialect, right? Just not use terms or phrases that you would normally use and try to sound more serious or well-educated or whatnot. And that's where the idea of covering or conforming comes into play. When there is a standard that's long but kind of unquestioned, if you don't sort of fit into that standard, you're seen as an outsider. And not only does it harm journalists for the ways we just talked about, right? It costs money to try to change your accent. It is often harmful literally to your vocal cords to try to change the way you talk. But also, I heard several stories from younger journalists who just said, I didn't think I had the right voice for radio, sort of like my experience, right? And that just means you're not even going to try. It's not even that you face discrimination. You're just sort of proactively not entering the field, which is a problem if we're trying to sound like our audiences in journalism.
Yeah. And for me, I think that I was thinking about what makes someone trustworthy to me. And a lot of times it's if they kind of sound like me too. So being able to hear yourself in radio is really important. And I wonder, do most local TV stations, or not even most, but some, do they have vocal coaches on staff?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, for instance, I spoke to somebody who had been for years. She just recently, I think, left, but was like NPR's in-house voice coach. So there was one person who would work. Again, I don't think it was like a weekly mandatory meeting, but I think a lot of on-air journalists could see this person as much as they wanted to. Maybe there were a couple maybe mandatory sessions if you were just starting off. And so, yeah, at that level, at sort of the national level, there often are, I think, voice coaches. There's things called air checks that I sort of learned more about in radio, where, every week or month or something, you'll talk to a producer or talk to people at the station to kind of not just about your voice, but, how are you doing the funding credits? And, are you following the right format for this? But some of it would be about vocal performance. So there's that built in. And TV, I don't know that there's in-house voice coaches as so much as there are agents that have people that they can refer people to, right? So less maybe kind of built in. TV, it's more of like appearance consultants that still exist to some extent, although maybe a little less than before. So, a lot of journalists that I spoke to who were kind of more starting off in the field, though, they had fewer sort of like formal voice coaching experiences, but more sort of just like a producer or a friend just kind of worked with them on something. And it was more kind of ad hoc. Like if they wanted to have some feedback, they could get it. Like it wasn't so formalized.
I think I'm remembering this story correctly, but Keith Morrison from Dateline, he said that it would have ruined him if he would have went to journalism school because he wouldn't talk the way that he did, that he would probably have been like taught out of it.
Yeah. Actually, the person who actually taught me voicing a few years ago said, yeah, he didn't go to journalism school, nor did he come up through sort of traditional public radio. He was in community radio, where the norms there are basically just talk. There is no instruction like that. He said he could speak a sound, So yeah, that's definitely true. I think sometimes how you were socialized professionally will matter in sort of how you end up speaking.
So how can people in media do better to promote diverse voices?
I would sort of separate it out into a couple different categories. So, one is just hiring. You have to start with having people in positions of power who are diverse. So the latest data I saw in radio and TV is like general managers and news directors, who are kind of at the top, are still 85% white or more and mostly male. And so one is just getting more diverse people in those positions. Also producers. So in radio especially, oftentimes it shows if you're on air, you're working with producers on tracking, on voicing. And so people who I talked to said that's important. Those people, because they're not only coaching you, but they're also making decisions about what takes to keep and cut, and also who to bring on for interviews. In other words, like a lot of times in public radio, people who aren't quote unquote good talkers, who kind of, aren't brought on. And often those are people who aren't brought on, people with heavy accents, right? There's been research on that. So that's just more diversity. Also just, I think, being more proactive and sort of, again, talking, if you're in leadership positions, mentoring, just talking to young journalists about, how do you want to sound? What are your goals? Maybe then saying, okay, here's our station, at our station, this is some of our goals and how we want to present ourselves professionally. Let's work out the details, but have that conversation rather than just like, hey, go see a consultant or a coach, this is a problem, or an audience member is complaining about your voice. Like if that's the first time you're hearing about voice, that's going to really spook you if you're a journalist. That shouldn't be it. And this last thing I'll say is just, I really think there has to be this. Again, I think a lot of times people who run media companies might feel like they have to please their audience, and there's some audience data out there about ratings and sort of what people like, but there's really not a lot about specific data that I could find on do audiences prefer X voice to Y voice, and a lot of it's just assuming what people will and won't gravitate towards. So I think just trusting that your audience, someone with an accent or who sounds a little different or who maybe sounds like they have a speech disability, that they won't find them distracting or off-putting, because research shows that the more you encounter voices that are diverse sounding, the less distracting you find them. There's good data on that. So that's just, trusting your audience, that good content wins out in the end.
Yeah. And that the people who complain the most are not the majority.
Totally.
Yeah,
yes.
Don't let them bully you.
Right. It might seem like it because they're the loudest on social media. But yeah, I mean, as we all know, like people who comment on social media, thank God, are not representative of everyone out there.
I still remember the time my dad got feedback from some random person listening to him on the radio. And they were like, it should be 0 degree, not 0 degrees. I was already in linguistics by this point, so I was just like, no, it's just wrong. Don't listen to him or her. I don't remember.
Yeah.
Anyway, are there any other things you want to let our listeners know about?
There were a few other, I mean, I guess we haven't talked about like accents and name pronunciations. There are really interesting stories that I heard where journalists, especially with sort of Spanish speaking accents, were getting complaints for sort of again sounding sort of generic TV voice, and then all of a sudden a word would come up that was again a street name that was certainly like pronouncing authentically. You'd pronounce it with a Spanish accent, or even saying their name. I mean, something as basic as that, and that would cause a whole hubbub. And so there was a lot of that, and again, a lot of accent reduction. Especially this was an issue again in sort of Spanish speaking broadcast media. So that's an issue again where it's sort of again like that's where the complaints. I mean, I don't think most people who run news stations really are thinking about this, but when you start getting complaints, that's when you're like, all right, well, we have to do something about it. But do you, I guess is the question, or do you just say, you just ignore it? I mean, in reporting this, I saw some outstanding auto responses and email responses to audience complaints. I don't know if you guys have seen that. I think it was the show 99% Invisible has this amazing, where they're like, basically, thank you for responding to this. We're going to give this exactly 0 attention, and, feel free to focus on other problems. So I do think, again, I mean, it's heartening to me that I think a lot of times with some of these non-issues, people in news do have journalists back. There is some hope as far as like supporting people when they're criticized.
Criticized for the pronunciation of your own name is the most frustrating.
Oh, yeah, totally. But I mean, I heard from several journalists who said in the first couple of years of their career, they just didn't want to cause a stir. And so they did not pronounce their name authentically, which the whole name thing came up all the time also. So it's something we don't think about in the audience, but it's a huge issue in journalism.
Yeah, speaking of 99% Invisible, one of the producers there also, she used to pronounce her name Lee, and then she was like on air explained, actually my name is pronounced Lay, and ever since then it's been pronounced that way. So yeah.
I wonder, real quick, did you learn anything that was surprising when you did this?
I was surprised. I mean, so the biggest surprise to me, again, was just how, I was really curious how journalists came to learn these norms. Because again, as we were saying at the beginning, they're not written down. It's not like they're bylaws. I was expecting to hear more people starting off, oh, well, when I got hired, I was told that I was sent to a voice coach, or I was, again, a lot of times there was just sort of this like natural self-selection that it's like people, if they got to the point that they were applying to jobs on air, they had already had a very firm idea of how you were supposed to sound. People had told them, even if no one who actually was hiring them had told them. It was almost like, I don't want to call it a back channel communication system, but it was almost like there were so many signals that they were reading when they were listening and watching the news that it was almost like they knew what they were supposed to do and if they were going to be able to cut it before they even got into the field. So the whole like socialization and way that people learn about what's professional in a field, I found to be really interesting because I wasn't expecting it to that extent. Just the amount of information they had in their brains about how they were supposed to speak and look before they even started day one on their job.
I guess we get socialized into this, right? Like what we see on the news, what we hear on the news.
For me, particularly for the TV, people who want to be on TV, it kind of makes sense to me that you would have to just be so perceptive and make sure that you see what the norm is, even if no one's teaching you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been really, really interesting. I could talk about the news all day. I'm not even it's not even my specialty, but it's so fascinating. We really appreciate you being here with us today. And we always leave our listeners with one final message. Don't be an asshole.
Don't be an asshole.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by me, Carrie Gillen, theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Vocal Fries Pod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com, and our website is vocalfriespod.com.